Hey friends, Adam from Mission Youth here. We're jumping into week 2 of Waitlisted, where we're talking about waiting and waiting and waiting. But before we jump into this week, you're going to have to wait just a little bit longer because last week, Amy introduced us to this idea, maybe for the first time for you, of Advent, which means to wait. And sometimes that means waiting and waiting and waiting. She also showed us from Scripture that sometimes following God means we're going to have to wait. God's timing isn't like ours, and to follow him means we're going to have to wait for him to move. But what are we supposed to do while we're waiting? Are we supposed to just sit there? And what happens when we wait and wait and wait, but what finally comes is not what we had planned? I remember one time growing up, my brother and I, we loved the game Monopoly. Well, to be honest, I think we both loved fighting with each other, and Monopoly always started some of the biggest and best fights between us. Seriously, if you want to see my brother and I turn white hot with rage, just mention Monopoly. But I remember one specific time where it got especially heated, and it all had to do with one game over Christmas break. This game went on for days, and after a few days of playing, my brother finally had me beat. He knew it, I knew it, and after I flipped the Monopoly board off the table before he could officially beat me, our parents knew it as well. Guys, I was mad. I had just sunk close to 48 hours of playtime into a game, and I had lost. Well, not officially, we never finished the game. And if my brother ever asks, I didn't lose that game, okay? But honestly, I knew I lost, and I was mad that after all that time of playing, the outcome wasn't what I wanted. Have you ever felt that way about something? Have you ever been disappointed by something you spent a long time waiting for? Maybe you know what it's like for life to surprise you with a big loss, a turn of events, or even a disappointment. Maybe you're feeling it right now with your parents' divorce, the loss of a big game, with a loved one getting sick, a mistake that just feels overwhelming, or the breakup between you and your boyfriend or girlfriend. When those surprises hit, we're often left waiting and wondering, why did this happen? How long will I feel this way? How do I fix it? Can anyone help me? Where is God? Or even, how long do I have to wait until things change? Maybe you're wondering if God can be trusted, or if he even really cares about you, or if he's even there. I mean, shouldn't the God of comfort be there for me while I'm waiting? If you've ever felt that way and can relate to anything I just said, know this: you are not alone. I want to introduce you to, and again, maybe for the first time, a guy in the Bible by the name of Paul. Now, Paul has a pretty awesome life story. I want to encourage you to go and read it in Acts 22. It's pretty intense. Paul ends up following Jesus, and that dramatically changes his life. And it's easy for us to assume that after he started following Jesus, everything just miraculously got better and his life was great. However, Paul's life ends up with some pretty severe hardships. He was whipped, he was beaten, he was stoned, he was shipwrecked 3 times. He was imprisoned even more times. He was traveling through dangerous areas, and basically he was scared for his life every day. We see one of those hard times in Acts 16, where Paul and Silas are beaten and thrown in jail for talking about Jesus. Verses 6 through 10 talk about how God led them to Macedonia, and yet they still ended up being beaten and thrown in prison. So if God led them there, why did they end up in prison? Did they make a mistake? Did God make a mistake? Did God put them in prison on purpose? The answer to all those questions is no. They were right where they were supposed to be. God had them right where he wanted them, and they were there for a reason. Acts 16:25 picks up our story of Paul and Silas in prison. There it says, around midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening. Suddenly, there was a massive earthquake, and the prison was shaken to its foundations. All the doors immediately flew open, and the chains of every prisoner fell off. The jailer woke up to see that the prison doors were wide open. He assumed all the prisoners had escaped, so he drew his sword to kill himself. But Paul shouted to him, "Stop! Don't kill yourself. We are all here." The jailer called for lights and ran to the dungeon and fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Guys, there are so many things we could bring out of this story. We could talk about how even in the midst of waiting, in the midst of suffering, Paul and Silas were worshiping. We could look at God's mighty and powerful deliverance by breaking the chains and opening the doors, not only for Paul and Silas, but also every other prisoner who might not have deserved it. We could dive into the selflessness of Paul and Silas to not immediately run through the open gates, but instead sticking around to save the jailer's life. However, I think there's a bigger point that we can draw from this. I want us to look at why God had them there in the first place. God had them there for the jailer. And as we read further in Acts 16, his family too. Yes, Paul and Silas's lives were interrupted by disappointment and crisis. I don't know if you know this, but being beaten and imprisoned really puts a damper on your day. Yet they understood something that we would be wise to remember. Even when Paul and Silas were waiting in prison, wondering what God was going to do next, they found a reason to worship. They knew God could be trusted. They trusted God was with them. They believed God would be faithful to them no matter what happened. And they knew this truth, that even while we're waiting, God is faithful. But here's the awesome thing, and I want to make sure you catch this. You see, oftentimes, God is playing 4D chess, and we're over here playing Candyland. He's on a whole other level above us. Because while we're focused on ourselves and the suffering that is our waiting, and while we can't see past the tips of our nose, God has this entire masterful plan orchestrated. While we're waiting, God is not only faithful to us, but to those around us as well. Whether you like it or not, and whether you notice it or not, people are watching you. Your friends are watching you. Your teachers are watching you. Your brother, your sister, your mom, dad, teammate, coworker, that weird kid down the street are all watching you. And those people see you and the way you respond in your suffering in difficult times. And what they see could be the difference in whether they come to ask the same question the jailer did. What must I do to be saved? Now, I want to ask you, is there anything more valuable in our suffering than that? I don't know what disappointments or crises you're facing right now, or that you'll be facing in the coming months or years. But when you find yourself waiting for God to rescue you, I hope you remember what we talked about here today. While you're waiting, God is faithful to you. God is faithful to you, even when you're not faithful to Him. Even when you're losing hope, even when you're filled with questions, and even when you're tired of waiting. So when you're waiting for God's rescue, or even just waiting for an answer to prayer, here's what I want you to do. Even take some time to do this right now. First and foremost, I want you to trust that God is with you, just like God was with Paul and Silas. Number 2, pray while you wait. Even if the only thing you can say to God in the moment is why or help, that focuses us on God instead of our problem. Number 3, I want you to worship while you wait. I know it's not easy to find hope or joy when you're discouraged. It's not easy to worship God when you feel abandoned by Him. But when you choose to hang on to hope and joy in the midst of darkness, I think you'll see your faith start to grow, and that light will keep getting brighter. Don't get me wrong, the problem may not go away magically, but your focus will change from look at this horrible problem in front of me to look at my faithful God surrounding me. And lastly, number 4, I want all of us to remember God's faithfulness. How has God been faithful to you in the past? How have we seen God's faithfulness to His people in Scripture? Guys, write down these stories and remember them. Then, when doubts and questions and waiting comes into your life, reflect on those stories to remind yourself of God's faithfulness. Just imagine for a moment the burden lifted from ourselves when we remember this truth. Imagine the testimony of God's faithfulness to those around us when we remember this truth. Imagine going through life, proclaiming to yourself and to those around you this truth, and having the peace that stems from it. Even while we're waiting, God is faithful.